Welcome to the deep dive. We take complex sources, pull out the key insights for you, make it quick and hopefully entertaining. Basically, your shortcut to getting up to speed. And today, we're diving into some pretty deep philosophy, actually. It's based on a source you sent us, Rabbi Joseph Baer Soloveitchik's doctoral dissertation.
That's right. Pure thinking and the constitution of being in Hermann Cohen's work.
Sounds a bit heavy, maybe.
A little, yeah.
But it's really fascinating stuff. Hermann Cohen, who's writing about, was this major figure, like the central figure in Orthodox neo-Kantianism back in Germany.
Okay, neo-Kantianism, so building on Kant's philosophy.
Exactly. Late 19th, early 20th century. Cohen was hugely influential philosopher of science, ethics, and he even had these big ideas about connecting German culture and Jewish thought. A really pivotal thinker.
And the author, Rabbi Soloveitchik, or the Rav, as he's often called.
Yeah, he later became, just this towering figure in 20th century Jewish thought, a major Talmud scholar, a leader.
Right. But this dissertation, this is early stuff, purely academic work from before his more famous writings on Jewish themes really took off.
So that's part of what makes it interesting, that this early academic phase.
Precisely. So our goal, our mission today, is really to get the core arguments of Soloveitchik's take on Cohen. And why should we care, right?
Yeah, why this deep philosophical dive?
Well, even though it seems purely abstract, maybe far removed from his later work, it actually lays some really important groundwork for how the Rav thought later on.
Okay.
And here's the kicker, the surprising thing. Both Cohen and Soloveitchik were deeply involved with Jewish thought in their lives, but this dissertation, it's pure philosophy. No explicit Jewish sources, no discussion of Judaism, just philosophy.
That is interesting. A paradox, almost. So how are we going to tackle this?
Okay, so first we'll unpack Cohen's big idea, scientific idealism, get a handle on that.
Right.
Then we'll look at Soloveitchik's critique, where he disagreed, what problems he saw.
Yeah.
And finally, we'll connect the dots. See how this early philosophical wrestling match, you could say, actually influenced Soloveitchik's later thinking.
That sounds good. All right, let's kick things off with Cohen. Scientific idealism. What's the problem he's trying to solve here?
Okay, so the big issue Cohen was up against was this kind of skepticism lurking in realism, the whole thing in itself idea from Kant,
The idea that there's a reality out there, but we can maybe never truly grasp it as it is.
Exactly. If objects exist totally independent of our minds, how can we ever be truly sure that our knowledge, our concepts, actually match up with that external reality?
Like, are we seeing the real chair or just our perception of it?
Precisely. There's a potential gap. Smilowitz, who analyzed the dissertation, uses a great analogy. It's like trying to translate perfectly between two totally different languages. If reality is one language and our knowledge is another, can that translation ever be truly spot on?
That really clarifies it. Okay, so that's the problem. What's Cohen's solution? How does he bridge that gap?
Well, he basically flips the whole thing around. He says, maybe we shouldn't think of objects as having this absolute being completely separate from us.
Okay.
So he argues that objects are, in a fundamental sense, products of thought.
Whoa. So thought creates the object.
Not quite physically creates, but constitutes its being, at least as far as knowledge is concerned. It bridges that gap because knowledge and the object become part of the same process. They're speaking the same language, to use that analogy again.
I see. So it's not mind versus world, but mind generating the known world.
You got it. The dissertation puts it nicely. The being of objects does not lie in a realm that is independent of thought. Rather, their being is constituted by thought. Thinking isn't passive reception, it's active constitution.
Okay. I'm following. But then mathematics, where does that fit in? That seems very abstract.
Well, for Cohen, math wasn't just an example of thought. It was like the absolute foundation, the purest form. Yeah. He strongly believed mathematical thought is really that thought which constitutes knowledge and being.
That does sound a bit strange from, an everyday point of view.
It does. And Soloveitchik himself apparently found parts of Cohen's system kind of alienating. But for Cohen, the rigor, the precision, the a priori nature of math, meaning it's true, independent of experience, made it the bedrock. Everything else had to be built on that logical certainty.
So philosophically speaking, the universe is kind of mathematically structured, according to Cohen.
In terms of how we can know it, yes. That's the core of his scientific idealism. And one other really key point about Cohen, his anti-psychologism.
Anti-psychologism.
Yeah, he was really insistent that philosophy, especially epistemology, theory of knowledge had to stay separate from empirical psychology.
Meaning separate from how individual human minds actually happen to think or feel.
Exactly. For Cohen, the laws of logic and pure thought were objective. They existed in their own realm, totally independent of the messy, subjective world of individual human consciousness. It had to be about pure logic, not psychology.
Okay, that's a clear picture of Cohen's system. Scientific idealism, objects constituted by thought, math is the ultimate basis, and keep psychology out of it.
Pretty much, yeah.
Right. So now, Soloveitchik, he reads all this, studies it deeply, but ultimately he's not buying it wholesale.
Not at all. I mean, he clearly respects Cohen's intellect, engages very seriously with the arguments. But yeah, the dissertation makes it clear he found Cohen's scientific idealism ultimately inadequate, lacking.
Where did he see the main problems? What couldn't Cohen's system handle, in Soloveitchik's view?
Well, the dissertation highlights several key areas. One big one was knowledge of particular individual things.
How so?
If everything is constituted by this pure, general, mathematical type thought, how do we actually grasp the uniqueness of this specific chair, or this particular feeling, or this individual person? Where does individuality come from?
Right. Universals versus particulars. That's an old philosophical chestnut.
It is, and Soloveitchik felt Cohen didn't have a convincing answer. He also had issues with how Cohen dealt with passive knowledge, stuff we get through our senses.
Like seeing the color red or feeling warm.
Exactly. If pure thinking is the only source of being and knowledge, what's the status of sensation? Is it just noise? Does it contribute anything meaningful? Cohen tried to address it, but Soloveitchik wasn't satisfied.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty major component of experience to downplay.
You'd think so. And then there was the whole issue of consciousness, the subjective side of knowing. Soloveitchik felt Cohen's focus on pure objective logic kind of sidelined our actual lived awareness. Where does the I that is knowing fit in? And related to that, what about the being of things that aren't easily quantifiable or reducible to logic, like emotions?
Can you have a mathematical equation for grief or joy?
Right. I mean, Cohen's system seems ill-equipped to handle the reality of emotional life or maybe aesthetic experience, things like that. Soloveitchik saw this as a significant limitation.
So the dissertation goes through Cohen's attempts to kind of patch these holes, but Soloveitchik says, nope, doesn't quite work.
That's the gist. He analyzes Cohen's arguments carefully, points out the tensions and inconsistencies, and ultimately finds the solutions wanting. And this critique leads Soloveitchik towards a different view, something called epistemological pluralism.
Epistemological pluralism. Okay, let's break that down. What does that mean?
Well, if Cohen's view is scientific monism, mono meaning one.
Right, one way of knowing, mathematical scientific thought.
Exactly. Then pluralism suggests, well, multiple ways. Soloveitchik, through his critique, starts pointing towards the idea that maybe there isn't just one single unified way to know reality. Maybe there are different kinds of knowledge, different valid ways of understanding the world, each suited to different domains.
So like the way we know mathematical truths is different from how we know historical facts, which is different again from how we understand a person.
That's the kind of direction it points in, yeah. He's pushing back against forcing everything into Cohen's very specific, very demanding model of pure scientific thinking. He's arguing for a broader, more nuanced picture of human knowledge.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It feels more aligned with how we experience the world. So this dissertation isn't just carrying down, it's starting to build an alternative.
You could definitely see the seeds of his own later thinking there. It's a critical engagement, but a constructive one, too.
Okay, let's pull back a bit. Context. Soloveitchik is doing this work in Berlin, late 20s, early 30s. What's going on then?
Well, as we said, Cohen, though he'd passed away in 1918, was still a huge intellectual presence. His ideas were very much alive, debated, influential, especially in German academic circles.
So it was natural for a philosophy student to grapple with it.
Absolutely. Especially someone interested in epistemology and the philosophy of science, which were hot topics. And Kant's legacy, which Cohen represented a major interpretation of, was still central to German philosophy.
And was Soloveitchik seen as like a follower of Cohen initially?
That's an interesting point Smilowitz makes. He notes that some might have assumed Soloveitchik was broadly sympathetic, but the dissertation actually reveals quite a strong disagreement on fundamental points. It shows a very independent mind at work.
And it's still striking. Cohen was so invested in relating German culture and Judaism, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yet Soloveitchik writes this purely philosophical treatise, ignoring those themes, precisely when the whole question of Jews and German culture is becoming Well, incredibly fraught and dangerous.
It is quite remarkable, and it's worth noting who his advisors were. His main advisor, Heinrich Meyer, was a leading Cohen expert, so Meyer's interpretation certainly plays a role in the background.
Okay.
And his other advisors covered different fields, de Suar, Bernhard, and Eugen Mitbuch. There's a story there, too.
Oh.
Mitbuch was a Jewish scholar, an expert in Ethiopic languages, and apparently, during the Nazi era, Mussolini needed his expertise for Italy's colonial activities in Ethiopia, and Hitler actually spared him because of it. A bizarre, unsettling footnote to history.
Wow. Yeah, unsettling is the word. And amidst all this, Soloveitchik focuses laser-like on these abstract problems in Cohen's philosophy. No Jewish sources mentioned.
None whatsoever, which makes the later connections even more fascinating. How did this deep dive into pure thinking actually shape his explicitly Jewish philosophy down the road?
That's the big question, isn't it? What's the through line?
Well, Smilowitz argues pretty convincingly for two main continuities. First, this epistemological pluralism we talked about.
Right, the idea of multiple ways of knowing.
That idea, born from critiquing Cohen's monism, seems to have really informed how Soloveitchik later thought about things like different kinds of causality, scientific versus, say, religious causality, or even understanding complex concepts like repentance, teshuva. He wasn't trying to make everything fit one logical model.
I see. So that framework allowed for different kinds of explanations in different realms.
Exactly. And the second key idea Smilowitz identifies is this theme of the eternal mystery of the unknown.
The limits of knowledge.
Yes. Smilowitz suggests this was influenced partly by Paul Natorp, another Marburg neo-Kantian, a student of Cohen's who later had his own disagreements with him. This sense that there's always something beyond our rational grasp and ultimate unknowability becomes a really persistent theme in Soloveitchik's later, more existential writings about faith, suffering, the human condition.
So even as he's analyzing Cohen's attempt to build this total system of reason, he's already sensitive to its inherent limitations.
It seems so. He sees the power of reason, engages with it intensely, but also recognizes where it bumps up against its limits. And, Tzvee Zahavy, who translated the dissertation.
He's a student of Soloveitchik's, right?
He was. And Zahavy points out that while this work showcases Soloveitchik's incredible analytical mind, his philosophical rigor, it doesn't yet capture the Rav we know from later years, the charismatic teacher, the public intellectual grappling with lived religious experience. This is the philosopher sharpening his tools.
Okay, this is fascinating. To really understand the debate, maybe we should dig into a few of Cohen's core concepts that Soloveitchik focuses on, like origin, Ursprung. What was that about for Cohen?
Right, Ursprung. This is absolutely central for Cohen. It's his attempt to find an absolute starting point for thought that isn't just given from outside.
Not relying on sensation or intuition as the start.
Exactly. He wanted thought to ground itself. Origin is meant to be this self-positing starting point. He famously said something like, thinking is thinking of the origin. Nothing must be given to the origin. Logic itself had to start from this pure, self-generated point.
So it's like the Big Bang of thought, but self-caused.
Kind of, yeah. It's meant to solve the problem of where thought begins, ensure its purity, and guarantee objectivity right from the start. It's the foundation upon which the whole edifice of knowledge is built.
And Soloveitchik analyzes how Cohen uses this.
Yes. He points out it has multiple functions for Cohen. It's tied to the infinitesimal method in math as a starting point. It's the ground for asking questions. It secures objectivity, and it relates to the identity of thought itself. It's doing a lot of work.
Okay. And how does pure thinking, Rein Denken, connect to this origin?
Pure thinking is the thinking that starts from the origin. It's that rigorous mathematical scientific thought we've been discussing. Cohen specifically contrasts it with naive thinking, our everyday uncritical engagement with the world. Pure thinking is disciplined, logical, and crucially for Cohen, free from psychic reality, from subjective contamination. It's the only kind of thinking that truly constitutes being.
Got it. Pure, originating from itself, mathematical. What about consciousness, Bewusstsein? Where does that fit in if we're trying to avoid psychology?
That's a tricky one. Cohen doesn't see consciousness as the foundation, like maybe Kant did with the transcendental subject. Instead, for Cohen, consciousness is more like a function of critical thinking. It's the lawfulness, the structure within thinking that allows thought to reflect on itself, to become aware of its own processes, and even to engage with sensation, but always by transforming sensation into logical content.
So consciousness isn't the source, but a feature of the system working.
Sort of, yeah. It's how pure thinking maintains its critical edge and relates itself back to experience, but on its own terms. It's a departure from how many philosophers, including Kant, thought about the role of the subject.
Okay, now being sein and reality, Wirklichkeit, Realität. These sound basic, but Cohen uses them specifically.
Very specifically, and this is a major point of critique for Soloveitchik. For Cohen, being sein is essentially identified with the object of pure thought. What pure thinking things is being.
Being thought object.
Pretty much. And reality, Wirklichkeit or Realität, is like a later, more concrete stage of determination within that thought process. As thought gets more specific, it moves towards reality.
And Soloveitchik had problems with this.
Big problems. He worried that directly equating being with the object of thought slides dangerously close to the ontological proof, the old argument that just thinking of God means God must exist. Soloveitchik felt Cohen's concept of being wasn't sufficiently grounded. It risked making existence purely a product of logic, disconnected from anything, well, real outside the system.
I can see how that would be a concern. What about the concept of task Aufgabe?
Aufgabe. This reflects Cohen's view that knowledge is never finished. It's an infinite process.
Always more to know, more problems to solve.
Exactly. For Cohen, the task is inherent in knowledge. As we solve problems and understand more, new, more complex problems and tasks arise. Thinking is this endless striving, this continuous process of tackling the next intellectual challenge. It's not a flaw that knowledge is incomplete. It's very nature. It's dynamic.
An ongoing project, never a finished building.
Nicely put. And there are interesting comparisons here with how Natorp, his colleague, thought about the task. But Cohen's emphasis is really on this perpetual forward movement of scientific thought.
Okay, last key term. Sensation, Empfindung. We touched on this. How did Cohen try to square sensation with pure thinking? It seems like the biggest hurdle.
It really was a major challenge for his idealism. If being comes from pure thought, what is this raw data from our senses? The general approach of the Marburg school, including Cohen, was to treat sensation not as a source of knowledge, but as a task for cognition. Meaning, pure thinking has to take this raw qualitative stuff from the senses and actively transform it into proper cognitive content, usually through mathematical or logical means like quantification. Sensation poses a question or a problem that thinking must then solve and integrate into its logical framework. Cohen struggled with how exactly this otherness of sensation could be incorporated without compromising the purity of thought.
So sensation is like an unknown that thought has to conquer and assimilate into its own terms.
That's a good way to put it. Soloveitchik digs into Cohen's various attempts to explain this, but again, finds them ultimately unconvincing. You can really feel Cohen straining to keep everything contained within the realm of pure logical thought.
You really can. It's like he built this incredibly intricate logical machine and then tried to figure out how things like individuality and sensation could possibly fit into it.
And Soloveitchik is there, carefully examining every gear and lever and pointing out where the machine seems to grind or falter.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive into their deep dive. If we had to boil it down, what's the single most important takeaway from Soloveitchik's dissertation on Cohen?
I think the crucial thing is seeing how this incredibly rigorous early engagement with a major philosopher, even on seemingly abstract, non-religious ground, was absolutely foundational for Soloveitchik. It wasn't just an academic exercise, it was where he forged key tools and perspectives like epistemological pluralism and a sensitivity to the limits of reason that shaped his entire intellectual trajectory. He wasn't just repeating Cohen, he was actively thinking through and beyond him.
It really underscores how formative those early intellectual battles can be, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The depth in this supposedly niche dissertation is quite amazing.
It absolutely is. And maybe it prompts us to think, how do our own deep dives, the seemingly abstract things we grapple with intellectually, end up shaping our core beliefs, our way of being in the world? What pure thinking in our own lives might be influencing our own constitution of being in ways we don't always recognize?
That's definitely something to chew on, a really provocative thought to end with. If listeners want to explore more, obviously delving into Cohen, Soloveitchik, maybe Kant and Natorp would be the way to go.
Absolutely. The conversation is still very much alive.
Well, until our next deep dive.
Keep thinking critically.
And keep exploring those depths.